Everyone in North America and South America, good evening. Good morning, everyone in Asia. This is a very special broadcast. We've gathered people from various points in the world to talk about something which has actually been the main concern of the entire world for the past year. It's been 1 year into a pandemic, and we want to learn what lessons we've had and how do we go forward. How do we do this in Latin America, and how do we do this in Asia? We have a program which is going to be broadcast in English. In Spanish, it's going to be subtitled later on, so you can actually um, hear it later on and read it in Spanish. And we have a number of very fundamental people who've actually faced this pandemic over the past year. We're going to be talking to Julio Frank, former Secretary of Health of Mexico, President of the University of Miami. We're going to be talking as well with Qin Lin, Ambassador at Large of Taiwan. We're going to be speaking with Jose Luis Sajian, Subsecretary of Health in Uruguay, and with Professor Te Wok Ho, Associate Professor, Department of Public Administration of the College of Social Science of Yonsei National University. First, I want to ask and give thanks, of course, to the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats and RELIAL, the Red Liberal de América Latina, the liberal network of Latin America. First of all, I want to thank these two organizations that have made this conversation possible 1 year into a pandemic. And I want to ask Berta Pantoja, President of RELIAL, to give us some words before we start. Berta Pantoja, it's a pleasure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, good morning. On behalf of the Liberal Network of Latin America, I offer you the warmest welcome. The collaboration with the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats is very important for us. I want to thank the two teams that have made this event possible. The CAL team, led by the Senator Paglialini, and the RELIAL team, especially Silvia Mercado and Brenda Rodriguez, Sigrid Hesot from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for the support, the distinguished speakers, and Sergio Sarmiento, President of Caminos de la Libertad, for agreeing to moderate this event. Finally, thank you, everyone who is with at this moment. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Berta Pantoja. And now we're going to hear from Francis Pangilinan, Kiko Pangilinan. He is the chairperson of CAL and senator in the Philippines. Let's hear from Kiko Pangilinan.
Good morning from Asia to our Latin American brothers and sisters on the other side of the world. Buenos dias, fellow liberals. Thank you to Berta Pantoja, my counterpart and president of the Red Liberal de América Latina, or RELIAL, our own Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, and Ziggy Herzog, regional director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom Latin America, for organizing this webinar entitled 1 Year into a Pandemic, Lessons Learned, Ways Forward, Latin America and Asia. To our distinguished speakers and guests, welcome. As leaders in among the most populous and most diverse regions of the world, we face the biggest challenges of turning this COVID-19 crisis into opportunity. As I said when I took over the chairmanship of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, leadership is a collective undertaking that, handled consensuously, could lead to something worthwhile. It has been over a year since COVID-19 wreaked havoc in our people's lives and livelihood. What we have learned in 400 plus days of the pandemic. Today is an opportunity to share some of the greatest lessons of the pandemic. These are: 1, that health is wealth. 2, that when we keep the world safe, we keep ourselves safe. 3, that we are one world facing a common problem and aching for a common solution. 4, that marginal can be central. And 5, that a healthy community of people and nations require democracy, a living and life-giving democracy that is relevant in our people's everyday, a democracy that brings hope, a democracy that empowers people to chart their own destinies and to tell their own stories. This relevant, hopeful, and empowering democracy is what our people need, and that is what we can all endeavor to provide in this unprecedented crisis. And in this webinar, share initially among ourselves and eventually among our people. I am a farmer. When I plant, I trust. I trust in the seasons, that this too shall pass. I trust in science that applied appropriately and in a timely manner will vanquish the virus. Finally, I trust in the seeds of cooperation and solidarity that we have been planting to eventually bear the fruits of democracy our people deserve and need to survive and overcome this crisis. Congratulations, everyone, and I hope this webinar will be a productive and engaging undertaking for us all. Thank you, and carry on.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kiko Pangilinan, Senator Kiko Pangilinan, for this warm welcome. It's quite unusual that we get people from both Latin America and Asia to talk about any kind of issue, but this is a substantial issue. This is an issue that brings together people from all over the world. But let me start with someone I've met, I've known for many years, Julio Frenk. He was Secretary of Health in Mexico, in my country. I've had a chance to talk to him many times. I admired him at a distance. I saw him create something called the Popular Insurance. That's medical insurance for people who didn't have money, who didn't have a job, who weren't covered for by the traditional insurance that we see in Latin America. He's now the president of the University of Miami. That popular insurance that he created has been now dismantled for political reasons by our present government. But anyone who actually had a chance to see how it worked is actually missing that popular insurance very much. Julio Frenk, please, it's your turn to join this conference.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for your very kind words. I'm delighted to be here sharing this stage at this very important moment, a year of this unprecedented pandemic, and I'm really delighted to join the distinguished colleagues from Taiwan and Uruguay, South Korea, and the Philippines. I thank the Latin American team of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom as we take a look into what's happened, especially in Asia and the Americas. I will begin by saying that the ills we have confronted this past year extend beyond the pandemic. Across the globe, we're facing what I call a confluence of crises. There is, of course, the public health crisis itself, a health emergency, the scope of which humanity has not seen in a century. Then there's the financial emergency caused by the pandemic, which has underlined the fact that health is not just a consequence of economic development, but one of its key determinants. And finally, there is the social crisis, the unrest fueled by the inequalities that the two other crises have made much more visible than before. The extent and depth of impact mean that countries are starting to think about what a post-pandemic world will look like, even as the pandemic continues to unfold. There is much talk about a new normal, but I believe we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to build a better normal, not just a new normal, but a better normal. And in fact, I think we owe it to those who have suffered so much so far to apply the lessons we have learned up to this point. As we look at the state of the pandemic and responses across Asia and the Americas, there are several lessons. But I want to focus this brief introductory remarks on 5, I would call them macro lessons, that we would ignore at our peril. We need to learn these lessons. So let me briefly tell you what I think are those 5 big lessons. First lesson is that unsustainable practices have dire consequences. The pandemic is not, or pandemics in general, are not natural events. A pandemic is as anthropogenic as climate change. It has the same root. Now, a pandemic is a very fast evolving crisis, whereas climate change is a much longer term crisis. And in climate change, we don't have vaccines. It's a little bit more complicated, but the root cause is the same. We have seen an increasing frequency of pandemics since the latter part of the 20th century. And that reflects the invasion of habitats by human beings, the unsustainable and inhumane practices associated with poultry and livestock. That's why we have avian flu, swine flu, and then those crowded and promiscuous so-called wet markets. All of these practices allow pathogens to cross the species barriers from other animals into human. COVID-19 should be a wake-up call about the need to protect our planet. One outcome of the pandemic must be a renewed commitment to sustainable development. Lesson number 2 is that we need to get over the false dilemma between public health and economic goals. I think that's what's hurt a lot of countries. Protecting public health and reactivating the economy should be seen as synergistic goals that need to be pursued together in a comprehensive strategy. As I said earlier, health is not just an outcome of economic growth, it is one of the conditions for economic growth to happen at all. Thanks to COVID-19, governments, businesses, communities, and individuals now clearly know, as our colleague, the senator from Philippines, was saying, that without health, there is no wealth. Third lesson is related to social inequality. In almost all countries of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected low-income and marginalized groups. This is reflected both in infection rates and in mortality rates, and now we're seeing it in access to vaccines. This reality really demands the design of interventions to deal with the underlying social conditions that allow for high rates of infection and death among vulnerable, marginalized populations. It requires also public policies to improve access to high-quality health care, like the ones I was privileged to introduce, that Sergio was mentioning. In addition, as we prepare for future pandemics, and there will be other pandemics, we must make sure that those preparedness plans include protection to the most vulnerable. Fourth lesson, and probably the most important, is the centrality of leadership in the response to a public health threat. To me, I am a public health professional, and the most striking feature of this pandemic is the huge variation in the effectiveness of national responses, even when you compare countries at the same level of economic development, facing the same virus, we're the same human species, and yet those countries have varied enormously in their response. And as I look around the world, I see one disturbing trend. The worst outcomes are seen in countries that have populist regimes. I am not saying that there's a cause and effect relationship. I am saying that there's an over-representation of populist governments or governments led by populist leaders among the worst responses. And unfortunately, we have an over-concentration of those right here in the Americas, whether it was the previous administration in the United States or the current administrations in Brazil and Mexico. That's where you see those three countries are the three countries with the highest numbers of death in the entire world. And that is because populist governments, first of all, they undervalue expertise and undermine science. And then they politicize behavior, because it's at the core of populism to divide people between the good people and the corrupt elites. That's the framework of the populist leader. And one example, which I think has been catastrophic, has been the way in which populist leaders have politicized measures, basic public health measures like wearing face covers. We're now seeing that even with vaccination. And this is the same whether they're right-wing or left-wing populists. They behave exactly the same. It's the populist syndrome. In contrast, the countries that have done very well are actually much more concentrated in Asia. Of course, we have very good exceptions in Latin America, and we'll be hearing from a country that does not have a populist leader, Uruguay. But we have seen better responses in Asia. And where you see the best responses, you see the opposite. You see the basing the response on science and on expertise, uniting people instead of dividing them. And we see them in some of the countries we have we have today, like Taiwan and South Korea. At the beginning, there was some idea that you needed authoritarian regimes, like in China, to mount an effective result. That is been proven wrong. Democratic regimes that bring people together happen to have had the best performance, and some of them actually have the interesting additional feature that they're led by women. This is the case of Taiwan that we'll be hearing, or another Pacific country like New Zealand. Finally, let me move to the last lesson. This is, of course, a global crisis, and the lesson is very clear. Global problems require global solutions. I am disturbed by the fact that some of these same populist, hyper-nationalistic leaders are using the pandemic as an excuse to insist on a xenophobic, exclusionary, hyper-nationalistic discourse, and that they may use the pandemic as an excuse to advance authoritarian practices. I think it's very important to guard against that. Global problems can only be dealt with global solutions. The best example we have is the amazing level of collaboration among scientists around the world, in academia, in government, and in industry from all over the world, that have delivered in record times highly safe and effective vaccines. But we need more than that. We need also a sort of new global compact so that we can actually provide better global health security. There are many, many proposals on the table. The Director General of the World Health Organization has proposed a new global health treaty. The important thing is that national governments need to collaborate and understand that pandemics put everyone at risk and no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that will require a new global regime so that countries are willing to share their sovereignty and engage in collective action to face common threats like pandemics or like climate change. I think we have no time to lose. We're in a race between vaccines and variants. We need to make sure that global access to vaccines is expanded. No one will be safe until everyone is vaccinated, and we have no time to lose. The good news is that I do believe we have the capacity to build on the lessons from the pandemic and implement some of these lessons we have learned. The question is how to garner the necessary political will, and that requires us to demand action so that we can truly build a better normal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Julio Frenk, President of the University of Miami, former Health Secretary of Mexico. Now let's move to Asia. One of the countries, a small country led by a woman, who's had a remarkable success, in spite of the fact that it had direct flights from China, from Wuhan, in spite of the fact that it was very, very near China, is Taiwan. So I want to ask Dr. Qin Lin, Ambassador at Large of Taiwan, to take the stand right now and let us know exactly what Taiwan did that achieved such remarkable success. Ambassador Qin Lin, thank you very much for speaking to us. We aren't hearing you. Maybe you're mute.
It's okay?
Okay, now we hear you. Okay.
Thank you, all our friends in Asia and Latin America, and our friends here. It's just until now, the pandemic still suffer many countries now, so it's really so sadness, and pray for all the friends in the world. And Taiwan actually, luckily, until now we actually keep our normal life. We go outside for school or for hospital, and I work in Parliament before 2020, and I go back to hospital after 2020 March. And then, until now, in my hospital, actually we still keep our regular medical service, and in government we still facing some very strong the challenge, but now we still could work with our people. I think is luckily. So today I want to share some experience, and the most I think very important is how to balance and how to maintain the democratic system and the equality in the country. And that is, I think that is very important during the pandemic, how to balance that and how to keep the life in the very normal situations. So please, next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to share some, now the condition in Taiwan. Our first case was noted in 2020, January 21st. Actually, in some the medical stuff, actually, because we have some conference or some cooperations with mainland China. So some doctors, they told us, hey, we alert something wrong in China. The information actually initiated in late of 2019. And actually, later I will show our government actions early. So in January 21st, 2020, we got first cases, and actually that cases came from Wuhan. That was a woman, she worked there. After that cases, until now, we have 1,114 cases, confirmed cases, and 11 of them are deaths. Around 1,000 are imported cases. The imported cases mean they actually come back from outside of Taiwan, and the local acquired cases are 79 cases, and many of them are get infected by their friends or families come from outside of Taiwan, or some cases were in hospital. And 36 cases are infected in street. That is our only one street cases. And some cases, actually, they are unknown original. So the actually, you could see the pictures there. In the pandemic, actually, Taiwan, we have a very few days cases, and actually, we still have a normal economic growth. Thank you. Next one. Thank you. I think the very important I want to mention is the more gender equality society. I think maybe we could have the less gender-based damage in pandemic. That I really worry about and care about. You could show you could see the pictures that the left side, that is middle-aged workers in our train stations, and another side that is our nurses and our ambassador, the Ministry of Health and Welfare Department. Actually, in just like Professor mentioned, that in many countries, the middle-aged women or some middle-aged men, actually they are the weakness in the society. And actually, when pandemic situations, they lack of the personal protections equipment, or sometimes if we have the very severe damage in economics, many of them are the most suffer from that, because maybe they were lost their job, because those of jobs are dangerous or very low income jobs. But in Taiwan, because very early interventions, and actually we make sure all the personal protection equipment could provide all the laborers in the workers in hospitals, workers in train stations, the workers in housekeeping, the workers even in the every environment workers. Even we have some migrant workers from South Asia. Actually, we make sure they could have personal protection equipment. So that actually protects them, also protects our people in Taiwan. Next one. Next, please. Thank you. We actually have two health case associated cruiser, and actually the only one health care associated cruiser, actually the cleaner get infection in hospital. That is very early stage during the pandemic, and until now we have others are some nurses get infections because of healthcare associated cluster in past 16 months. I think that is very important because we had ever experienced about SARS in 2003. And 2003, the SARS, actually, we have so many doctors, nurses, and health workers or even cleaners in hospital suffer from the SARS, even deaths. So actually, since 2003, we have the practice lections every year in hospital to make sure all the hospitals workers could have the knowledge and have the knowledge to prevent pandemic in hospital to get infections. And in this is healthcare associated cluster infections. Most of them are women. Actually, their job are nurses. That we are still, because they are the first line to contact with patients. And we have one male medical doctors acquired from his patients. This is only two the medical staff they get infected from patients. Next, please. I think we mentioned about leadership. I also want to mention about leadership a little. I think the female leadership may be that a little different with traditional leadership, that they are not such self-concerned counter to or too much conflicted to their magnitude, that they were more sensitive to alert that we need face the pandemic more carefully. So we could see many leaders in the world. They some maybe are male leaderships. They actually make themselves suffer from pandemic, even get infections. So the leadership in Taiwan actually is very fast, but our president actually they trust the professional team in Taiwan. So actually since late of 2019 until in past 1 year, all the leaderships in the policy in the policy makings in the COVID-19 policies actually depends our professional team works. The professional team works based on the epidemiologies and science evidence. And we say the politicians, doctor as a president or our ministers, their job is to coordinate the different departments to make the policies work. Next. We have, I think the very important I want to mention that we have law and regulations to, we named that Communicable Disease Control Act. The act actually revised after SARS 2003. That's very important, that is we have a category 5 communicated disease. For example, the SARS, COVID-19 actually in the category. And we calculate that disease, it means all the disease, or if the case we alert about that, need to notify the government, that the government very clear understand, very clear to know how many patients get infections and how many people act the risk to get the infections. And we in the Article 17 in the law actually have very important is we have the central competent authority. It means because usually we know in the democratic countries, the local government have their right to have their regulations in local, but in pandemic, actually, it were not within one country, within one area. Actually, it's a whole nations. Even now, we know the pandemic actually is globally. So in Taiwan, as the law, we have the central competent authority, means when we alert that it is a pandemic in the countries, all the orders and regulate will depend on the central government. Because Taiwan is not a huge country, so the central government could have the right to have regulations to make sure every county or every area, local government have the same regulations. For example, now the vaccinations, all the different local government need to obey the regulations for vaccinations, or need to obey the control about the accreditations or the securitations. So I think that is very important because we learned the lessons from 2003 SARS. So when the pandemic initiated in Taiwan, we have the open the CECC, the central the leaders of government. Then until now, every regulations is obeyed on that. I think that is very important. The regulations and law. Next, please. And transparency is very, very important during pandemic. I want to mention that even during pandemic, even last year, we still suffer from fake news and malinformation, and the fake news actually come from mainland China. So everyone know when pandemic, people will have anxiety and people will have the panic. So if the transparency is not enough, the people were very worried about the government hiding something. Even now, we still have some people that they do not believe we have set control the pandemic. Even sometimes have some make information that maybe there are so many people suffer from the COVID-19, but the government do not let us know. So we have the news conference every day since pandemic last year until now. The news conference every day, they show how many cases get infected and how the original from them, and how many people contact with them are be checked, and how many patients check are negative, check are positive, and what the policy will begin since when, and how people could prepare that. So the transparency is very important, especially in democratic country, because everyone are discuss about during pandemic if the democratic countries, actually the democratic systems will suffer from the pandemic or damage from that, or the democratic system, if that is difficult to control people. But we in Taiwan, our experience show us the transparency is important, and it could maintain the democratic management at the same time to make the pandemic get be controlled. Next, please. You could see the pictures that every day in our central control systems, our bureau, the Health and Welfare Bureau, have so many pictures to show how many cases get infected and where are the original sites and what their symptom signs, and some of their basic informations from maybe from US, maybe that work in hospital, and all the pictures, all the number are so clear and clean. Everyone, all the people could just very clear, very simply open the website in the government and get all the informations, and even the professors, they could get the numbers, analysis, the policy, and to have the viewpoint or to discuss with government or with the professional teams. Next, please. And you could see the line times. Actually, we alert about the pandemic very early. In the 2019, the late of December, because we alert about that. So we alert our population that we know a typical pneumonia in China, and all the information we are connect with WHO. We have a letter to them, but the letter to them, they actually, I think everyone knows that now WHO didn't alert about that. So this sad pandemic happened, and in or at the same time during that days, we alert that we check all the fever passengers before they landing, and all the airplanes from Wuhan. I think the first stage we make sure all the people come back from Wuhan could be checked. and to make sure they did not get fever. And we initiate our the category 5, the communicated disease alert in the 2020 January 15th. Because before that, actually, I want to say that before just 1 week before that, we just finished our president and legislature elections. So you know that even during the elections, the government still alert about the pandemic maybe happens from China. So we have very fast actions to alert our people, and we list the SARS-2 to have the special infected disease and make the initiate all the procedure to maintain, to control the pandemic. Next, please. So next, please. Yes, the very alert about the information from China, that is important. So that in Taiwan, sometimes we are suffer from the fake news and information from China because of the same language. But another side, we also could alert something happened in China because we know the language. So that another thing that we have information and policy pictures from CECC. Actually, I mentioned that we have a daily news conference, but maybe sometimes not so many people were to see the news conference. So every day the CECC will show the pictures. The pictures were made it very easy to spread. I think in Asia we used to use Line, WhatsApp, or even Facebook. So the pictures from CECC, that is very easy. We could spread that. All our friends, families, the hospitals, government, to spread the very clear and correct information to make people understand what happened now. And I want to mention that is very important and very good tools to make our people do not be interfered by fake news in Taiwan. Next pics, please. The very important is medical equipment. I want to mention that is security of country. I know many countries, in the global society, we try to make different countries, different industry in other countries, or because of the economic considerations, we were use many the companies, many the industry were moved to China, but when pandemic happened, the problem is for example, the medical equipment will be locked in China. So I think all we know in the early of the pandemic, the US, the Japan, even some countries, they lack of the face mask because the face mask resources are come from China. So when the traffic lockdowns or even the country's policy changing, there were lack of the medical equipment. Taiwan, actually, we have the experience in 2003. So these times when we alert about the pandemic, the government have the budget and the government have programs to find all the companies still in Taiwan to make sure we could to provide the medical equipment, especially the face mask. So within 1 month, we make sure that all Taiwanese could have to have the medical equipment, especially the face mask, every day at least 1 face mask. It's important that to when we have the policy to ask people when they go to the public area to make sure you have face mask. Because when you want to control the pandemic, but you lack of the face masks, you lack of the personal protection equipment, actually you couldn't to announce the policies. So to make sure, I want to say that all the countries, we need to have the policy renew that use the equipment actually that is security of your countries, to make sure medical equipment, to make sure some very important daily life equipment or daily life the resources, make sure that even during pandemic conditions, your country could provide by yourself, or sometimes it may be difficult to provide by self, but you could cooperate with your friendly countries or the same viral countries to have a we said the trade equality trade to get the equipment with another countries. That is very important. Even during the time we're facing the pandemic, we need to review all your countries, that how your resources, how your equipment should be had to make sure you have the ability to product it by yourself. Next, please. Of course, I want to say that the safety distance and alerts the information from China. I do not only focus about China, but because most of the our countries, and this time our conference, the countries actually all we are democratic countries. The democratic countries have very important values that all the information need to communicate with our people. So when people suffer from disease, when people have viewpoint, when people have the professional viewpoint, actually we want to make sure the policy that government could get information from people, from professional team, to trust or to respect all the science. But China, actually, they are not a democratic country and they control all the information. This time, the COVID-19 pandemic, we know because they control the information during the early stage of the pandemic. So then so many people get infected in their country, they suffer from the disease. But also until now, for example, today, the India people, they still suffer from the disease. And even until now, in Taiwan, we have vaccination policies, but we still be interfered by some fake news or disinformation from our newspapers, from our social media, and many of the social media actually they have some relations with China. So we could see the pictures actually that in Japan they have so more and more traveler, the visitor from China. I think very of countries we know, China is such huge country, so we depend on their economic corporations, we depend on their industry, we depend on their many cheaper labor workers or cheaper the productions, and many countries depend on their travelers to have to increase economics. But all that problem is the countries, when we suffer from the pandemic, or when China changing their policies, actually we were facing something to interfere with our economic or our policies. I want to mention teeny a little that during the late of 2019 and early of 2020 in Taiwan, because during our president elections. So during that time, China banned their visitor to Taiwan. So that actually during the early stage of the pandemic, Taiwan have the less China visitors. And for the economic, actually, we know that is a problem because the less visitor here will interfere our economic. But in the pandemic, actually, that is good luck for us because we do not so many infected people here come from China. So I think we need to have some information in the future that one is media literacy. In Taiwan, we actually, just I mentioned, then because of language, so we actually a little, sometimes this fake news or disinformation come from China or even within Taiwan. So the media literacy, I think all the democratic countries are facing that. So how to have a different policies or the transparency during in the future to make people have a better media literacy that were important to make sure your policies or your decision making could more clear communicate with people, and the most balance between the public health and the controls people's freedoms. In Taiwan, of course, all the country have the policy how to balance that. And this time in Taiwan, actually, we try to balance that. I think the balance is really work, make people do not be too many interfered by the policies, but also they have the freedom to have their daily life and the freedom of themselves but we keep the country safety in the pandemic. And the third, very important, is the economic depend and feasible. All the countries, actually, we know in past decades, we have a global policies. All countries, corporations, or move the industry to another countries. But now the pandemic let us need to consider it about you still need to have your country have the economic feasible. How when pandemic happens, we could have a more clear and more fast reaction to balance that do not be interfered by the pandemic. I think have some experience to share to every friends. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Qingji Lin, Ambassador at Large Taiwan. We're going to change the order. I don't know if Professor Tae-Wook Ho of South Korea can take the stand now, can go online right now, since he has to leave very shortly. Professor Tae-Wook Ho, please let us hear from you. You have to unmute your microphone. Por favor,
okay, thank you. Yeah, good morning from Seoul, South Korea. Sorry for this, but I think I can join the following discussion time until 11 a.m. in Seoul. So probably 11 p.m. there. Not sure about it. Anyhow, I have 45 minutes left. Anyhow, I will make it done my presentation in 10 minutes as expected. So
yes, 10 minutes is what we have forecast. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is Professor Steve Paul from Gyeongsang National University. I'm very pleased to talk about the political economics of the pandemic in South Korea. Next slide.
The next slide, por favor, la presentación.
Well, yeah, exactly. So first, I want to talk about COVID-19 confirmed cases and vaccination in South Korea. Next. The achievement of so-called quick quarantine. So this Monday, the last update data, almost 0.12 million confirmed cases in South Korea. So 0.23% of total population. And also the vaccination. So just earlier I checked the recent data. So 2.8 million people vaccinated. So it means over 5.3% of total population at this moment. Next slide. So actually, most South Korea have been proud of the government's handling of virus. This picture shows the daily epidemic preventions. So left pictures at Starbucks, and right picture shows that South Korea is one of the countries with the highest economic growth rate in the last pandemic situation. So according to OECD, as you can see. Next slide. Well, according to Bloomberg COVID resilience ranking, South Korea's in Feb on 8th rank, and last year on 4th. Actually, COVID resilience ranking consisting of 1 month cases for 100,000 and total deaths for 1 million, and access to COVID vaccinations, and etc. Next slide, please. Well, this is the South Korean vaccination scheme. So vaccination supply period and the medical institution and vaccination centers involved for vaccination. And finally, Korean government has a target to make people vaccinated, actually 70% of the whole people, national people, before 4th quarter, so until September, hopefully. Okay, next slide. However, according to CNN, so this was almost 2 weeks ago article, says New Zealand and Australia and also South Korea will have COVID success stories, but we are behind on vaccine rollout, and said a bold game in the US and UK in the vaccination. Do you agree with it? I'm not sure yet. Next slide. Well, so yesterday data. So the number of coronavirus confirmed cases and instance means total confirmed cases per million population. Still, US on the first, and yesterday over almost 50,000 confirmed cases added. And what about UK? Over almost 3,000, over 2,000 daily basis. Well, South Korea is around 600, 700 daily basis. Actually, UK is 1.2 times bigger than in population, and US almost 3.5 times bigger than Korea. But in terms of coronavirus confirmed cases, over 7 times in UK, and 3 times for 7 times for US, 3 or 4 times for UK, and instance as well. So total confirmed case for billion population, so red star, absolutely first, US and UK is very severe as well. So in my opinion, not yet bold game, but still sad game at this moment. So next slide. So part 2, case quarantine and new classes in the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. According to Robert Reich, the former minister of the US government, COVID-19 pandemic shines light on a new kind of class divide and its inequality. So first class is remote, who are capable of crossing crises. So professional, managerial, and technical workers. And the essential, and nurse, home care and child care workers, and truck drivers, sanitation workers, and policy officers, and etc. And however, the unpaid class, so larger group, the same as in the Great Depressions, and the forgotten. So social distancing is nearly impossible. Prison, jail for undocumented immigrant, homeless, and etc. Next slide. So what about in Korea, the unpaid? So mostly self-employed and small business owners. So the unpaid implies that class divide, inequality, quarantines, and government failure. Actually, in Korea, the proportion of self-employed is over 25%. So tied for 7th with Costa Rica among 38 OECD member countries. Colombia ranked first, over 52%, followed by Greece, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and Chile. A large proportion mainly in Latin America countries. What about US? With the lowest proportion of self-employed person, around 6%, followed by Norway, Russia, Denmark, and Canada. So in Korea, self-employed proportions about 4 times higher than that of US and 2.4 times that of Japan. So self-employed people are hit hardest in the pandemic in South Korea, actually. Next slide, please. And reduction in earned income and widening gap in asset income between classes. So income decreased in all classes and gap deepens due to rising real asset prices. So decline in income severe for the low income class, and income gap between classes widens. So, and also particularly gap between classes contrasts sharply in real estate asset rather than income, as the figure shows. So real estate income, real estate asset in 5th quintile upper 20% increased by 5.7%, while property asset in 1st quintile lower 20% decreased by 8.5%. So in short, in 2020, the gap between the 1st quintile and 5th quintile was 164 times. So the gap is widening. All right, so next slide, please. So final part, gaps created in the era of COVID-19 in South Korea. Next, please. First, education gap in the with COVID-19 era. So according to survey results recently, of 20,000 students, the primary and secondary students, the children of upper income families have a higher understanding of online classes. The left figure shows that the children of low-income families have many responded that their digital device, such as computer, laptop, are obsolete and interfere with classes. On the other hand, the better the family situation, the more private education. The right figure shows more private education to supplement the online class. So in short, expansion of education gap due to distance online education. Next slide, please. Second, gender gap in the with COVID-19 era. Employment shock. Employment shock is greater for women than for men. The woman more engaged in a vulnerable occupation, not only in Korea, but I think it's a global trend, including education, childcare, tourism in the pandemic. So among the core working groups, as the figure shows that the number of women employed decreased by 541,000 compared to the same month in 2015, before COVID-19. So 1.7 times the decline in the number of male employed. So currently the result, gender gap of employment shock are expected to expand further. So because this data is occurred just in the beginning of current COVID-19, the pandemic, so March 2020, or probably this year, 2021, it'll be more expanded further. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, how to tackle the variety of new normal, so-called, so Korean implication. First, national employment insurance in progress. With the rapid spread of new employment type, the institutional protections for various types of employees expanded to break away from that. And also introduction of social insurance system managed by people who work beyond fixed workers. For example, platform workers in gig economy, and strengthening on institutionalized social safety net that can protect the vulnerable from economic and social crisis in the pandemic. So promoting national employment insurance that can protect all citizens with unemployment allowances, and also target to expand governments, actually target to expand employment insurance subscriber to 21 million people until year 2025. At this moment, in 2020, 14 million subscribers. So this is the government target. And second one, bridging the education gap. In the pandemic, multilateral efforts to improve remote online classes are required. And second, education that provides the joy of learning, participation beyond self-directed learning is necessary. And finally, guaranteed basic education and excellent education for all is required as well. Okay, this is all from me, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tae-Wook Ha. And now I would like to ask José Luis Sajian, Viceministro de Salud del Uruguay, Vice Minister of Health of Uruguay, to speak to us for a while. Vice Minister, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sergio. Hello, everyone. Uruguay bet on citizen responsibility and solidarity for reason of political concept. We also made a strong commitment to the proper use of personal freedom. In our country, we can say that we have two pandemics, or rather, it was a pandemic with two totally different behavior. Until November of last year, the incidence of cases and deaths was very low. Then the cases began to increase around the end of the year, and we are currently experiencing the first wave of the pandemic. We managed to delay the intense community circulation of the virus for more than 9 months. Some high-impact isolation measures that we took at the beginning of the pandemic add to the behavior of the people who referred. Was that allowed us to control the pandemic during those months. Scientific support in the decision of the executive branch creation of the Honorary Scientific Advisory Group made up of the most prestigious scientists in our country to have scientific advice in decision making. Continued training for human resources to anticipate a situation of tension in the health system, strengthening of health teams, purchases of respirators, monitors, opening of new intensive care beds. In Uruguay, vaccination is carried out with the slogan that the best vaccine is the first to arrive. Vaccination is voluntary, with the understanding that in the face of this new, unknown, and unprecedented health situation, we give freedom to the citizens who chooses if they want to receive the vaccine. Although it is strongly urged to do because it's the way now so far. To get off of the pandemic, thinking about the objective of the herd immunity necessary to overcome this health situation. It was decided to have enough vaccine so that all people who wanted to could be vaccinated, so that once the vaccination process of the population, there were no interruptions that would slow down or jeopardize the expected result of immunity. Vaccination in Uruguay was thought in terms of balances between the people most vulnerable to the COVID-19 disease with the highest risk of infections, and the different vaccines with their own characteristics that the government acquired. Thus, in the first priority group were people who performed tasks with a lot exposure to the virus, such as essential one, military, police, or firefighters. Also, in the first group, education workers were considered because there are population exposed to the virus, but also because education is one of the main concerns in relation to the repercussions that the pandemic will have in this area. This group was vaccinated with the CoronaVac from Sinovac. Those older than 70 years and nursing homes were given the vaccine from Pfizer BioNTech laboratory, already tested and with excellent results in those groups. In this way, today we are in 7th place in the world in terms of percentage of the vaccination population, only surpassed in the region by Chile and in the world by Israel, United Kingdom, and the United States, Bahrain, and Hungary. Projections show that we will soon reach the 70% vaccinated population necessary to achieve herd immunity as indicated by the World Health Organization. Uruguay is a full democracy in which there is a freedom of opinion and a space for people and groups that disagree with the measures taken by the government to express themselves. This climate of tolerance and respect is what prevails. Uruguay was weathered most of the pandemic, so far without major political disagreements, and have meant the use of pandemic for partisan political purpose. There is a general social consensus that vaccination is a way to get off this health crisis and strong management support, always based on scientific data with great involvement and dialogue of the political sector with science and science academy. One of the pillars of the good management of the pandemic has been the united political sector, standing behind the fight against COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Minister Sadjian. We have a little time for some discussion. I can't see right now our panelists, but if Pamela would put them all on, I'd be able to see them. You said something, Dr. Frank, that was very striking to me. You said that at least some of the worst countries, or some of the countries with the worst performances during this health crisis, have been populist governments. Is there a link to that, or is it just a coincidence?
No, I think there's a link. I don't think it's a cause and effect relationship, but let me put it this way. Not all the countries that have had bad performance have populist leaders, but there is not a single country with a populist leader that has done well. And that's a striking observation. And the explanation is what I mentioned. There's this populist syndrome starts by dividing people. And what you need in an emergency is to unite people. Populists distrust science and expertise. And what you need in a pandemic is to be guided by the best scientific evidence. And populists, in their attempt to divide people, politicize public health measures like the use of face covers or now vaccination. That has been a major source of a disaster. It is interesting. Dr. Lin Qingyi, the ambassador from Taiwan, I think made a very interesting observation. You have the other pattern, which is that the countries that, among the countries that have performed best, you have an overrepresentation of women, and none of them are populist, and they have done exactly the opposite. They unite, they follow the science, and they don't politicize public health measures. And that's the case of Taiwan and of New Zealand, but it's also the case of Norway and Denmark. And it is a sharp contrast. So that to me is one of the lessons of the pandemic. And populism in general is a threat to democracy, but that threat has been augmented by the pandemic.
Dr. Qingyi, Lin, you talked about a gender gap in the pandemic, even in Taiwan, with all the success that Taiwan has had. Is it something to worry about, this pandemic, this gender gap that you talked about? Could you unmute your microphone?
Yes, the microphone, yes.
Yeah.
Initially, I really worry about the gender gap in Taiwan, but of course, most of in Taiwan, we know the female labor rate is decreasing in middle age, but and all we know the gender segregations that most of the women they actually in charge in the housekeeping and cleansing workers, or even in hospital. Actually, I mentioned about in 2003, many of the middle-aged women actually they in charge the cleaning workers in hospital. But during that times when the policies we actually people will forget they need the equipment to protect themselves. So because of that, so these times in the very early stage when we make sure the people have especially the medical staff need to have the personal protective equipment, we alert the government. We have some information to government that you need to make sure all the staff in the hospital or in the very dangerous places they could have the equipment. And I want to say that in Taiwan actually we have maybe half billion are the migrant workers. And the migrant workers, especially in Taiwan, many of them actually work in the house to keep the older peoples or some bedridden peoples. So actually, they are facing the most special populations. If they get infected, of course they will suffer from that, and the patients or the people that they care are also suffer from the pandemic. So another that I want to say that we try to decrease the gap. We have different language, as I understand. We have 6 or 9 foreigner language, the Indonesia, Vietnam, different language to have the information to the migrant workers in Taiwan, let them understand our best mask policies and how to wash their hands and prevent them and to protect themselves, and but also to prevent the pandemic in the nursing station, nursing hospitals or in the spatial working in working environment. So I think that this, I mentioned that democratic countries, very important policy that how to make sure the transparency and communication systems, and the communication systems for, of course, all the government, in the government managers, they have the they think about the different population is important, but more people could have the information or have the viewpoint to alert them that you need to consider it about different populations in the countries and to decrease the gap. I think that is important in these times.
Dr. Chin Jilin, thank you. And I'd like to ask Professor De Wook Ha, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Professor. You talked about the self-employed, the unpaid. You said that they were the hardest hit portion of the population. Were there measures specifically aimed for them to help them, regardless of the economic measures, but to help them prevent infections? If you want to unmute your microphone, Professor.
Yeah, again,
Yes.
I make a header. Yeah, thank you for your brilliant pronunciation for my name and as well.
I was practicing. I was practicing.
Great. Yeah, a few days ago, the Oscar supporting actor winner Yeong Yoon said about the kind of name pronunciation as well. Well, actually, yeah, as you said, and also President Frank said as well, so there is a huge gap and also a tremendous problem for that unemployed people and also the unpaid people in South Korea. Actually, not only in South Korea, but in the worldwide situation as well. Well, I think as an institutional staff, and as I pinpointed just earlier, the national employment insurance should be expanded in the national wide. Actually, only fixed workplace workers in the fixed workplace in traditional workplace could get that kind of insurance at this moment, but it should be expanded not only for fixed workplace workers, but also the platform workers in gig economies. And this is the target of the employment insurance of the Korean government. And also the flexible social distancing is necessary at some times, but in Korea only less than 5 people can gather that in private place at this moment. So this is a huge impact, negative impact for that small business workers and that their income. So this is so the pinpoint policy can be applied in terms of the flexible social distancing according to the trend of pandemic and trend of COVID-19 in South Korea.
Thank you, Professor To Wook Ha. And I would like to ask Vice Minister Sajian a question. Vice Minister, Uruguay is a very small country in between two giants, Brazil and Argentina. What did you do with immigration? What did you do with movement of people across the borders to prevent infections coming from other countries?
Thank you, Sergio. I'm going to give the word to my interpreter. En Uruguay, tú decías, estamos rodeados de dos grandes países.
We're between two big countries.
Que en algunos puntos tenemos frontera seca o en la misma ciudad.
Some point we have like only a street.
Land crossing line. If you allow me, si me permiten, voy a traducir yo directamente. If you allow me, I'll interpret directly. Entonces, hay muchos puntos con frontera seca. There are a lot of land cross border lines that are very easy to cross.
la estrategia original fue el cierre de fronteras donde había puente o alguna división geográfica.
The original strategy was to close the borders where there were bridges or another kind of land crossing point.
Pero teníamos esos lugares donde era la misma ciudad con un borde imaginario, específicamente entre Uruguay y Brasil, donde se veía un desafío mayor.
But we have some areas that were very difficult because we have some cities, for example, that only have an imaginary border between Brazil and Uruguay.
Hacía muchos años habíamos firmado entre los dos países un tratado de cooperación para casos de emergencias, como en este caso la pandemia de coronavirus.
Many years ago, we signed a treaty of collaboration with Brazil for cases such as this, for a pandemic such as the coronavirus.
Eso nos permitió visualizar la ciudad como una única unidad sanitaria.
This allowed us to visualize a city as one sanitary unit.
Más allá de las medidas que tome Brasil o que tome Uruguay, eso se conjugaba en una única ciudad y nos permitió compartir recursos, compartir información y compartir estrategia de combate al coronavirus en esos puntos fronterizos.
Regardless of the measures taken nationally by Brazil or Uruguay, this allowed us to have these cities operating under certain different criteria with sharing information and sharing all of the data that we were getting.
Ahí fue el desafío mayor que tuvimos durante este año de pandemia.
That was the biggest challenge we had in this year of the pandemic.
Porque las otras fronteras tienen límites geográficos e impusimos normas de ingreso muy excesivas, con hisopados anteriores a las 72 horas, con cuarentenas y con control de los visitantes que llegaran del exterior, con lo cual no hizo que represente un problema para el Uruguay esos visitantes.
The other areas, the other border areas were very, very easily isolated. They had geographical boundaries, and it was relatively easy to put a stop to people crossing the border.
Muchas gracias, Sergio.
Is José Luis Sajian, Vice Minister of Health of Uruguay. We're coming to the end of this presentation, this webinar, 1 year into a pandemic. I would like to ask Francis Blue Abaya, Secretary General of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, a member of the House of Representatives of Philippines, to address the audience right now, this international audience.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you, Francis.
Thank you to our distinguished speakers and guests for the illuminating discussion on the lessons learned and the ways forward as we have battled this global pandemic that COVID-19 is for over a year now. Indeed, it seems that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem. Even in regions with more similar cultures and sensibilities, our responses to the pandemic have been varied. Sadly, my country, the Philippines, is lagging behind our ASEAN and Asian neighbors in almost all the important metrics relating to the management of COVID-19. Locally, we have had to assure ourselves that the best vaccine is the one that is available, or the best vaccine is the one in your arm. But I personally think that we have lulled ourselves into thinking this way because we did not plan carefully. Having said that, it is also true that there is a continuing inaccessibility of vaccines to poor countries. This lack of vaccines, coupled with the threat of new strains, has resulted to more cases, overwhelming our healthcare systems and crippling our economy due to lockdowns. But our ability to learn from each other, to take out the best practices of each other, and to work together as nations united in a cause will be a key in surviving this pandemic. When we look to science and research breakthroughs to contain these viruses, we also realize that this alone will not guarantee effective control of the pandemic. There needs to be a top-level political commitment to use science to tackle the pandemic decisively, and in a way that is the best for society. I hope that the lessons we have learned here today will help us in our respective work as we influence the policies shaping our country's response to this global health crisis. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Blue Abaya, for these words. And now I want to ask a friend of mine, a man that I've been working with for a long time, Siegfried Herzog, Ziggy, Regional Director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, Latin America, to address us all. Ziggy, please go on.
Thank you very much, Sergio, and thank you all for being with us this evening. I'm really happy that we've been able to put together this really fascinating talk and this sharing of experiences between our two liberal networks in Asia and Latin America, two regions I've both been working in. I think we've learned a lot tonight. Certainly I've learned a lot. And the key takeaways, I think, have been that the key in battling the pandemic was a smart government response. And we've learned that this has been best done by democracies who were led by leaders who were able to unify their countries. And this often seems to have been done best by women. So we have a clear indication of a gender gap here and a quality gap. Autocracies have done less well, and populists, as Dr. Julio Frenk has pointed out, have done least well. And that is because the smart response requires, I think, a trifecta of listening to scientific evidence, listening to expertise on how to best deploy the available instruments, and also a transparent communication. These are things that autocracies are often not very happy with transparency, and populists have trouble with all three. So this is, I think, a key takeaway, and one that we as liberals, as defenders of liberal democracy, should take heart from. We also see that the pandemic has had a very different impact on different social groups. I think Professor Teku Hu has pointed that out very forcefully, and this is something we need to take into account in the future. In general, the third takeaway, I think, is that we need to make our countries more resilient and plan a bit more ahead. Taiwan has shown us that they have been smart in learning lessons from 2003, from the SARS epidemic, and hence have been able to confront this new epidemic with far more expertise and far more preparedness than all the rest of us. Lastly, I would like to thank the teams of Relial and of CALT, led by Silvia Mercado and Lito Arlege. I would like to thank very warmly our excellent speakers, Julio Frenk, Li Qingyi, Jose Luis Sajian, and Tebu Ku. I would like to thank especially you, my good friend Sergio Sarmiento, our excellent moderator today. This has been really a pleasure having you guide us through this important topic. And thank you all for listening and taking the time for this important discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ziggy. Thank you all for joining us on behalf of Relial, the Red Liberal de América Latina, the Liberal Network of Latin America, and the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, CALT. Thank you very much for joining this discussion. This is it, and hope you'll join us the next time we get together.